Today, I have the privilege of speaking with Joel Richardson, a New York Times bestselling author, filmmaker, teacher, and internationally recognized voice on topics such as biblical prophecy, Israel, Islam, and the Middle East. Joel is the author of numerous books, including When a Jew Rules the World, The Islamic Antichrist, Mideast Beast, Sinai to Zion, and his more recent book, The Gospel of the Skull Crusher. Through his writing and teaching, Joel has challenged Christians to rediscover the deeply Jewish and biblical context of the gospel, understand God's continuing covenant purposes for Israel, and take seriously the role of the Middle East in biblical story. Welcome, Joel. Let me see the technologies. Welcome.
Marcis, it's a pleasure to be on with you. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you for taking your time all the way from Latvia. Greetings to you. And maybe we can start with the most controversial question that everybody has been probably waiting to hear. Are you partially Latvian?
So this is true. This is true. I just mentioned it just before the interview. So on my father's side, my grandmother, so my father's mother, I didn't tell you this part of the story. So her parents, the father was Lithuanian. My mother, her mother was Latvian, and they had 10 children. They were all boys, 10 in a row, and they all died either in childbirth or shortly thereafter, before the age of 4. 10 that all died.
Mm.
And then they had 10 daughters. And so literally 20 children, and my grandmother was the last of the 20. And that's from where I get the Latvian name Abel. So a lot of people don't know my surname Abel, but it actually comes from Latvia.
Wow, okay. That's even more special than I thought. So I heard in some interviews parts of it, but it's very special. So this is probably your first interaction with the Latvian, as far as are you aware of it?
I think so. I think so. There was I'm trying to think. There was a little nursery rhyme that they used to sing when I was a kid. Yeah, da, da. It was like about a little cat or something. Does that ring a bell?
I'm not sure.
Babushka. I don't know. It was
Okay.
some song about a cat that they used to sing when we were kids, and it was either Lithuanian or Latvian. I'm not a very good singer.
Awesome. That's a great start. So maybe to slightly less controversial topics today. I want to use the time with Joel regarding especially the book When a Jew Rules the World. First of all, highly recommend it. A great book. Will get my hands on the physical hardcover copy tomorrow. I've read it on Kindle, of course. So I think it's a great book that is highly helpful on the topic of Israel. And today, just through various questions, we will have a conversation, I think, through the lens of it. So maybe we could kick off with this question. In my experience, some Christians see Israel as like a niche theological topic that has to do little with Israel, with following Jesus, and so it seems maybe for some other more fanatic group or something of that sort. Maybe you could help today to the viewers understand why would you say Israel is actually highly important to understanding the bigger biblical story and God's redemptive plan as such.
Yeah, no, this is a great question. So, first of all, there's a lot of history here, but let me just begin by saying that roughly half of the church today, I don't know the exact numbers, but let's say half of the church holds to what is called supersessionism or replacement theology. So, this is the idea that in history, God began with the people. He chose Israel almost like a chrysalis, that births the butterfly, so to speak. And once Israel gave birth to the Messiah. Then the message of the gospel went out to the world, and the Lord sort of threw away the chrysalis. He didn't need Israel anymore, and that we as the church have replaced Israel. So, in a nutshell, roughly half of the church holds to some type of a theology like that. The problem with this is that The Bible was inspired in a very particular order. Think of the Bible maybe like a cathedral. The foundation of the cathedral, the platform that the whole thing is built upon, is the Torah. And then you have the earlier prophets or the historical books and the Psalms and the Kings and the writings. And then you have the latter prophets, which are the actual biblical prophets. Think of those like the walls that are built on top of the foundation. And then, of course, the New Testament, think of it like the roof. The book of Revelation is maybe the sort of capital on the top and some of the finishing elements, but no one tries to understand the roof apart from the walls. No one tries to understand the roof apart from the foundation. But unfortunately, much of the church today does just this. And the reality is the foundation of the story that the entire Bible tells from the beginning to the end is God calling and choosing Israel as a very unique and special and peculiar people through which he would bring redemption to all of the world. Now, obviously, Jesus has come. He came the first time, and the message of redemption has gone out to the rest of the world, to the Gentiles. But that in no way, shape, or manner erases or eliminates or overrides all of God's original foundational promises to redeem Israel. And so, unfortunately, too much of the church today, they are relatively Old Testament illiterate. They're not really familiar with the foundational prophecies and promises that God made repeatedly, reiterated them numerous times throughout the Bible, throughout the Old Testament. And they just jump right to the end of the story. They jump to the roof, so to speak. They read the New Testament. They're familiar with the New Testament. And they often read the New Testament, I'll say, through a very Gentile, sort of biblically ignorant way. They misunderstand a handful of passages, primarily in the writings of Paul, and then they fundamentally attempt to reinterpret the Old Testament. So the idea that Israel is some fringe subject in the church, Jesus would view those who think that way. He would think they're the fringe. Paul would think they're the weird ones.
Hmm.
And so for those who do understand the Israel centricity of the story, their view is much more in alignment with Jesus and the apostles and the New Testament and the entire Bible.
Great. So, continuing on this path, you touched the supersessionism or replacement theology, and the question is, if the New Testament continues to speak about God's purposes for Israel, how did it come that the church moved away from its Jewish roots towards this type of teaching and theology? And maybe with this question, kind of speaking, of the roots of the replacement theology, you could also share maybe nowadays what are the consequences of this theology, if so.
Yeah. Well, I would say, first of all, Paul the Apostle, in his letter to the Romans, chapters 9 through 11, this is the most concentrated portion of the New Testament that addresses the issue that we're talking about. And in that, Paul makes it absolutely clear God has not rejected Israel. He's not discarded Israel. He's not moved on from Israel. But he does explain that the majority of them have actually been blinded or hardened. And when he says that, it can sound offensive, particularly to Jews today. But the reality is, Paul was simply expounding upon the words of Torah. He was expounding upon the words of Deuteronomy, in which the Lord says, he says, I have not yet given you a mind to know, or eyes to see, or ears to hear, down to this very day. So there's, down throughout history, the majority have essentially, in God's sovereign plan, been hardened, blinded. He has not given them eyes to see. It has always been a faithful remnant within Israel that were truly walking in faith. They were living up to their ultimate call as Israelites or as Jews. And so then Paul explains that that's the way it's always been. He refers back to the time of Elijah. He goes, look at the way it was in Elijah's day, where Elijah says, Lord, kind of, I'm the only one left. And the Lord says, come on, don't think too highly of yourself, Elijah. I've got 7,000 that haven't bowed the knee. But if you think of the context of an entire nation, 7,000 is not a very big number. And so Paul says, look, even back in Elijah's day, it was just a remnant. It was a subset of Israel within Israel that was faithful. Paul says, it's the same in my day. He goes, I'm a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin. I'm an Israelite. And he says, but I'm a believer. There was also in the first century, during the time of the New Testament, a subset of Israel that they received their Messiah. They believed in all of the promises. And then Paul says, but at the very end, and again, he's expounding upon the words of the prophets, there's coming a time when it won't just be a remnant, a portion of Israel, it will be all of Israel. All of Israel. And so there are numerous Old Testament prophecies that promise this. And one of the most well known is Jeremiah 31. In verse 1 and 2 that begin the whole chapter, he says, in that day, which is an eschatological phrase. It's a phrase that refers to the last days or the time of the Messiah, the kingdom of the Messiah. He says, in that day, I will be the God of all the families of Israel. All the families of Israel. And later he says, in that day, it will no longer be like this, each one teaching his neighbors how to know the Lord. He goes, no, they will all know me from the least to the greatest. And this is in the context of him saying, in that day, I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. It's not going to be like the covenant that I made with them at Mount Sinai, the covenant that they broke. He says, no, this covenant is going to be such that I'm going to write my Torah on their hearts. I'm going to put my commandments on their lips. I will put the fear of me into them. And so Paul explains this in Romans 9 through 11. Now, to answer your question, that was written in the 50s, in the first century. I believe in the 50s, Paul already had the foresight. He saw the propensity of Gentiles to fall into arrogance. He saw where this thing was going, and he says, listen, many of you will say, hey, some of the natural branches, talking about Israel, they were broken off, and I came in, and look, I believe. He goes, yeah, right, yeah. He says, but if you're arrogant toward the natural branches, if you look down on them, if you give yourselves over to conceit or arrogance, he says, you also will be cut off. So Paul was warning about one of the greatest dangers of Gentile Christians, which is arrogance. And the reason that so much of the church today holds to replacement theology is that this arrogance, Paul was right, it blossomed, it grew, it spread. And in fact, I would argue that this Gentile arrogance, this view that they had replaced Israel, God's covenant people, rather than being graciously grafted into what God was already doing with them through the remnant, the faithful remnant of Israel, as a result of that, much of the church embraced this replacement theology. And I would argue that that is the foundational doctrine from which all of the major errors of the early church emerged. That was the fountain of error that gave birth to Gnosticism and so much of the errors that have pervaded in the church ever since. And then you asked, well, what are the potential ramifications? What happens if we hold to this view? Well, as I document in my book, When a Jew Rules the World, it resulted in 2,000 years of Christians, Gentiles, mistreating, abusing, actually murdering the Jewish people. To their shame, the church has blood on its hands. So bad theology produces bad actions. And most Jews are relatively familiar with this history. Unfortunately, most Christians are not. Most Christians are not aware of the fact that Christians, most Protestants today, they'll say, oh, those people were not real Christians. Well, no, they were. Christian theologians throughout Europe, for hundreds of years, they wrestled with what they called the Jewish question. So they looked at all of these Jews that lived in their midst as their neighbors, who, according to the scriptures, had been exiled. They had been driven out of their own land because of covenant unfaithfulness. And these Christian theologians said, well, if God's punishing them, how should we treat them? And that became known as the Jewish question. And the church was divided. Some said we should mistreat them. Maybe if we're harsh toward them, they'll repent. Others said, well, we should be kind to them. Maybe they'll repent if we're kind to them. And eventually, this theological debate in the church eventually led to Martin Luther in Germany in the 16th century, writing a book at the end of his career called Concerning the Jews and Their Lies, in which he lays out 13 responses. And he says, and I will settle the Jewish question once and for all. He says, to all of you Christian princes in all of the different districts, he says, if you have something better, then let's hear it. He says, but here's what should be done. And he says things like, drive them like screaming dogs from one city to the next, burn their synagogues to the ground, make it punishable unto the punishment of death, take away their prayer books and their shawls. And then he says, and do the same things to their houses, because they commit the same blasphemies therein. And this is, for all intents and purposes, Marcis, this is Christian ISIS. Christian ISIS, coming from the words of Martin Luther, the founder
Mm-hmm.
of the modern Protestant Reformation. And then Hitler comes along. Hitler was not a Christian. He was a thoroughly Nordic pagan. But he essentially said, I'm going to settle the Jewish question once and for all. And that resulted in the Holocaust. He was building upon the bad foundation of horrific theology that came to a head after hundreds of years that Martin Luther articulated, that pervaded German culture. And Hitler was able to do what he did because of Martin Luther. And again, most Christians are not aware of this history. We've walked in the arrogance that Paul warned against, and it is imperative that discerning Christians educate themselves, become aware of our horrific history, and correct the unbiblical, destructive theology that has led to all of this.
Yeah, it's really alarming. I think once I read your book and actually visited Yad Vashem itself, just actually seeing the parts where Christians represent part of the dark history that the Jewish people have had to go through. So you mentioned Martin Luther. That, to my knowledge, whenever I mention some of those quotes, it kind of shakes people because they haven't heard about it. It's usually, news. He's mentioned to kind of only show the great sides, of course, that he carried. At the same time, this is, to my knowledge, really ignored for the most part. But maybe you could briefly touch on where did the split happen, maybe in the first centuries, where the maybe either specific theologians or quotes, or just like where the turn happened, that this sentiment really had its root taken place.
Well, in many ways, it was a gradual turn that took place over time, but the foundation, or the genesis, the beginnings of it, was really the Jerusalem persecution. So the early years of the church, this Jewish sect, this Jewish movement, this Jewish first century apocalyptic movement, it was persecuted by the majority who rejected Jesus, or Yeshua, as the Messiah. And so when the persecution broke out, it was actually Rome in the first century. The leaders of the church, the majority of whom were Jews, were dispersed, and many of them ended up in Asia, up in modern day Turkey, and really throughout the region. And so the church in Jerusalem specifically came to be led by Gentiles. And much of the leadership of the church over the next 150 years came to be dominated by Gentiles. And so even at the end of the first century, as many of the Jewish disciples were disappearing, John the Apostle lived quite old, probably into his 90s. But by the end of the first century, you see the writings of Justin Martyr in his famous dialogue with Trypho the Jew, in which he makes statements where you already see Paul's warnings coming into fruition. He says, he's talking about the Christian church, he says, we are the true Israelitic race, for we have been quarried from the bowels of Christ, whatever that means. But he uses the term, the true Israelitic race. And so think about this, Martis. Today, throughout the world, we have this really insane controversy over transgenderism. People say I was given the body that I was not. I have a female soul but a male body, or this type of thing. It's genuinely a type of mental illness. I'm not saying there's not a very, very, very small minority of people throughout the earth who are born, with hermaphroditic conditions or this type of thing, but it's extremely small. The majority of people today who are transgender actually have an emotional, psychological issue or illness, you could say. But the idea that when you believe something different, it changes your race, that, for example, a Latvian, if he believes in Jesus, suddenly he is now a new race. He's part of an Israelitic race. What you believe, this is not transracialism. The Bible does not teach, the New Testament does not teach transracialism. We don't change races. When Christians believe in Yeshua, they don't become Jews, they don't become Israel. Rather, Paul says we become spiritual children of Abraham. So, like Abraham, who was a Gentile, but he, by faith, was saved. He believed in the Lord and in his Messiah and his seed that would come forth from him. He was saved. And we, like Abraham, as Gentiles, are spiritual children of Abraham. And we are grafted in. We are equal heirs. We're not second-class citizens. But the view that we become, the new Israel, is simply the result of two things, I would say. Gentile arrogance, which I've already mentioned a few times, but also Greek philosophy. So much of the ancient Middle Eastern world was dominated by, let's say there were two worldviews that were contending for the hearts and minds of most people. One worldview is the biblical worldview, which in a nutshell teaches that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. A few verses later, it's all good. But in Genesis 3 and Genesis 6, there's corruption. The curse enters the cosmos. All things in heaven and earth are corrupted. That's the biblical worldview. Jesus comes, the Messiah comes to redeem all of creation, all of the cosmos. He's going to restore the planet, all things in heaven and on earth. That's the biblical worldview. The Gnostic or the Greek, you could say the Platonic philosophical worldview. Again, Alexander the Great had just a few hundred years conquered the whole Middle East with a goal, an imperialistic goal, to spread his philosophy, to spread the Hellenistic Platonic philosophy. That view holds that the physical realm, the earthly realm, that it's corrupt, it's lesser, and it's essentially an illusion. That ultimate reality is actually immaterial. It's spirit. And so the goal of Greek philosophy is really to escape the shell of the body, or if you're stuck in the body during this life, it's to transcend the body. So it's a philosophy that emphasizes metaphor, spiritual interpretations and this sort of thing. And so it was very easy for many Gentiles that had been raised with this mentality, that were not familiar with the biblical worldview. They embrace the gospel, but they bring with them this sort of Greek worldview. And so they say, well, I am the spiritual Israel. That's the idea. And also they can't tolerate the idea that the Bible teaches that the Messiah is going to come back and establish a kingdom from Jerusalem, from Mount Zion, over the whole earth. Because the goal, again, is to escape the shell of the planet, the shell of the body, to attain these ever-ascending spheres of immaterial spirituality. And so as a result, you can see the effect of this throughout much of the church, embraced what is often called the beatific vision, which is the idea that the goal of Christianity is to someday die and become a spirit in heaven forever. Someday I die and go to heaven forever. Whereas the Bible actually teaches resurrection, that in the future there's the return of Jesus, the day of the Lord, the resurrection of the physical body, and the renewal of the planet. So that was the genesis. It's two things: Gentile arrogance and pagan philosophy that infiltrated and corrupted the church. You start seeing it in the first century, and in my book, When a Jew Rules the World, I trace the development of this thought throughout the early church writers and theologians, right up until Martin Luther.
Excellent, thank you. And maybe to continue, how would you say what's a healthy way? You talk about this Platonic Greek mentality and saying this language of we are the spiritual Israel, like kind of theology that has crept in. how maybe you could like summarize the New Testament language when it comes to the Gentiles, the nations coming together, with the Jews, Ephesians, this one new man theology, and maybe the grafted in language. How would you explain it maybe in a simple way when you would disciple someone?
So there's various analogies and pictures that the New Testament uses to help us understand it. But in a nutshell, the Lord looked down at the earth. It was comprised of many different nations, and he wanted to redeem all of them. He wanted to introduce himself to all of them. He wanted them all to have the opportunity to know him because he is the self-revealing one. When I find something I love to share it with my friends. God is good, and thus he wants to share himself with his creatures, and that includes all nations. But in order to do that, he chose one particular nation as his ambassadors, as his representatives. You could say Israel as a people and as a piece of property, as a land. It's the springboard. It's the launching pad. It's the base of operations whereby he's going to redeem all the earth. And so there is a priority to Israel in terms of, he came to them first. But you could say it this way: God so loved everyone, God so loved the world that he chose Israel as his vessel to reach everyone. And again, the gospel has gone out to reach everyone, but he never does away with his original promises to also redeem all of Israel at a particular time. And so some of the analogies that the New Testament uses, as you said, are one new man, which is to say this is, you're Latvian. I'm actually, as an American, I'm Lithuanian, Latvian, German, Polish, Portuguese, English, Irish, and Italian, and Tunisian. So, like most Americans, we're a big mixture of a whole bunch of different things, but the world is filled with, you've got Fijians and you've got Tongans and you've got Russians, you've got Ukrainians. The Lord loves variety. He loves spices. He loves all the different spices in the spice cabinet. And the kingdom of God is not just vanilla. It's not just salt and pepper. It's paprika. It's Hungarian paprika. It's all of the different spices and varieties. And the Lord celebrates all of these things. And he never erases our ethnicities, our identities, all of the beauty that he's put into us. He doesn't erase that. Rather, when we become followers of Jesus, he says it's one new man. And the primary template or the primary categories through which the New Testament understands these things is Jew and Gentile, which is to say Jews and all of the other people. And we all together become one people, one family. No one has priority over the other. We are all unified, but we maintain our distinctives, whether it's Jew or Gentile. And that's why if we're Gentiles, I was a Gentile growing up. When I became a believer, I did not become Israel. I did not become a Jew. I stayed a Gentile. And that's why Paul in Romans, he says to the Roman believers, to the believers in Rome, he says, I am speaking to you who are Gentiles. He doesn't say who were Gentiles. There are some times in the New Testament where he does say you who were formerly Gentiles, but what he means is our behavior. We're still ethnically Gentiles. I'm still Lithuanian, Latvian, German, Polish, Portuguese, English, Irish, and Italian, Tunisian, but I don't behave like the Lithuanians anymore. No, I'm just kidding. I don't behave the way that I formerly did.
That's great. Yeah, great. So my next question is when we look to Israel regarding the end times, one part is looking back, the historical, the biblical framework of the past and the prophets, but the past connects us to the future. So maybe again, it's huge topic for sure, but how should you say Christians should understand the return of the Jewish people to their ancestral homeland and the establishment of Israel in 1948, and maybe with that connected, like end time role of Israel as such?
So the main issue that most Christians need to understand are the covenants. You'll often hear Christians say, "Oh, the new covenant supersedes or replaces the old covenant. And then you say, which old covenant? And they just go, the old one. You go, you do realize the Old Testament has multiple covenants. You have to be specific. And the the writer of Hebrews, had a particular covenant in mind when he said the Old Covenant. He was referring to the Sinaitic covenant. So the foundational covenant, really, for the whole biblical story, it really is the Abrahamic covenant, in which God made a unilateral promise. He made a unilateral promise to give the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, i.e., Israel, to give them the land, the promised land, forever. It belongs to them. He reiterates this promise many, many times. If you look at Psalm 106, or is it 105? 106, 5 through 11. Or is it Psalm 105, 6 through 11? My brain is not working right now. He makes it clear. He says, to you, like the children of Abraham, the children of Israel, he says, I've given you this land forever as an everlasting covenant. So when God makes a promise, he's faithful to keep it. Now, just to use this as an analogy, I have a 15-year-old son. If I give him a car, I put the title of the car in his name, that's his car. If I take away the keys because he messes around, he does something wrong, I might hold the keys, but it's still his car. And throughout Israel's history, well, in the Sinaitic covenant, the covenant that God made through Moses at Mount Sinai, he gives Israel the stipulations, the rules, the regulations, the commandments, the decrees. If you obey me, then you remain in your land. I will be your God, you'll be my people, you'll be blessed, and you'll stay in your land. But if you don't, all these horrible things will happen. Most of you will be killed, and you'll be spit out of the land. You will live in the land of your enemies. And that has happened, by the way, multiple times in Israel's history, according to the words of Moses. We saw it with the northern invasion, the northern Assyrian invasion of the 10 tribes in Israel, the northern kingdom, and then with Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian invasion of Judah. And then we saw it later with the Roman destruction of Israel in the 1st and 2nd century. And both times we saw the remnant dispersed among the nations as exiles, as Moses said would happen. But he says in Deuteronomy, he says, but after you've been there a while, I'll bring you back. I'll bring you back to the land. He says, because I will never forget. Even when I've punished you, I will never forget the promises that I made to Abraham, to the fathers. And so, yes, 1948 was indeed the fulfillment of the words of Moses. It was the fulfillment of prophecy in the same way that their judgment and exile was the fulfillment of prophecy, so also was their return. However, and this is important for our Jewish friends, it is not the final return. When you read the words of the prophets of Jeremiah, of Ezekiel in particular, the ultimate final restoration to the land is with the Messiah actually leading that return. All of the people who return to the land are repentant, fully walking in faith, following their Messiah. And as much as I would consider myself an Israeli nationalist, which is to say I believe Israel, or Zionist, I absolutely believe Israel has a right to exist, has a right to defend itself. I largely support the actions of the Israeli government over the past few years to defend itself, to protect its people. In as much as I support the state of Israel and defend them, it's not a secret that the majority of the people of Israel today are not faithful. They're not walking that repentant spirit, and the founding of the state was not in repentance. There is yet another time of chastisement that the prophets promise for the state of Israel, and as horrible as it is, as unfathomable, as unthinkable as it is, October 7th was very much kind of a microcosm of what we see warned about in Deuteronomy 28, 30, in the words of Moses, and it's kind of a small picture of what the prophets speak about happening at the end of the age. One final, really horrible time of chastisement that will lead to all of the remnant of Israel returning to the Lord, returning to their land forever. And so that, in a nutshell, is the good, the bad, and the ugly, if we understand God's covenantal plan as it's unfolding.
Yeah, thank you for that. Very, very clarifying. Maybe now, as we are getting closer to the end of the interview, I would like to maybe touch some of the maybe geopolitical side of the questions. Again, it's a short bit, but at least touching it a bit. As to my experience, I've noticed that these days it's almost you can teach about it biblically about this topic and historically, but it's so interconnected with the geopolitical events, right? And which is again connected with the prophets and the things to come. Which, by the way, Joel's channel, Wine Press, right? That's the name of your YouTube channel. Yeah, does amazing job of, I think, connecting the prophecies, the prophets of old, and the connection with nowadays eschatological events, and making it grounded, I would say, which is a rarity these days on YouTube, just to say it clearly. But the question, Joel, from my end to you would be like this. Could you help us to understand, as Christians, slightly at least the history of Gaza conflict from Israel's withdrawal in 2005 and the rise of Hamas to where we are today? Kind of what has happened over like this time span, and what's kind of the Islamic ideology and mindset that has shaped and is still shaping Hamas and much of the current conflict?
Yeah, so this one is very difficult, but let me just say that with the founding of the state of Israel, it's not purely team good guy, team bad guy. There's good people and bad people on both sides. There were, you could say, even terroristic type of factions in the early founding of the state of Israel. And there were good Arabs. That said, it's complicated, and Israel did indeed have a right to their land, and the Nakba, the time when many of the Arabs fled their homes came because the surrounding Arab nations were about to engage in a massive assault on Israel, and they warned the local Arabs, get out of the way so you don't get killed in the midst. And so they fled as a direct result of the warning of this multinational attack that was about to happen. So today they complain and they say, well, the Jews stole our land. Well, that's not really the majority reason in terms of why many of them lost their land. It's they fled their land in the midst of a war. Like, war is horrible. And so as the state was settling, you had the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, where many of the Arabs live. And then you had many down there on the coastland of Gaza. And originally they were part of Egypt, but ultimately, eventually get segmented off. Now, it was occupied up until 2005 by Israel. There was an agreement settled where Israel would withdraw under pressure from the nations, from the United States. And many of the settlers were there actually abandoned, their homes and everything. It was a really horrible time. Many people strongly disagreed in retrospect with good reason for that. But not only is this difficult on the Israeli side, but the Gazans are also rejected from Egypt and really any surrounding nation. So they are in many ways kind of locked into this small piece of land. Israel did allow, before October 7th, roughly 30,000 a day would exit Gaza to work in some of the southern communities in Israel. So Israel had a regular work program where, again, 30,000 or so could come in and work. But what happened is a political party, or a religious political party, emerged, which is Hamas. And when you read the very founding charter of Hamas, this is a radical Islamic movement. The very founding charter actually says that it exists. The primary reason it exists is to fulfill this particular Islamic prophecy that says the day of resurrection will not come until the Muslims fight against the Jews and kill them, until there are only a few Jews left hiding themselves behind a tree or a rock. And then the tree or the rock will cry out and say, oh, faithful Muslim, Abdullah, servant of Allah, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him. And so what's really kind of a dark prophecy is that on October 7th, that's in many ways what happened. The majority that were there at the Nova Festival were slaughtered, and many of them were hiding in the trees. And then many of them were found and killed, and many others dragged away and raped, again, according to the words of Moses, when he says, most of you will be killed, and the
Mm.
few that are left will be dragged away into the land of your enemies. So, for all of the talk that Israel has committed a genocide in response, it's an absolute scam. It's complete propaganda. It's utter nonsense. Israel has not carried out a genocide. Genocide is a word that has meaning, it has a definition, and there has been absolutely no genocide whatsoever by any definitional standard. But there was an effort to carry out a genocide, and that was an effort by Hamas, by the Gazans, to carry out a genocide on Israel. They tried and they failed. Praise God, they failed. But Israel then responded rather harshly, or it would appear rather harshly to the world. I would say rather strongly. But the reality is, Hamas did this. Hamas produced this because what they did is, as the Palestinians, the Gazans in particular, they garner the sympathy of the world for their suffering. The world donates billions upon billions of dollars to them. They've used all of that humanitarian aid to turn Gaza into a bunker, into a military bunker. And they deliberately intertwine their military infrastructure with civilian infrastructure, deliberately, cynically, in a dark and evil way, knowing that if Israel ever attempts to dismantle this Hamas terror network, that there'll be civilian loss of life. And Hamas doesn't care if their own people die because they know that when Israel defends itself, the world will turn against Israel. And that's exactly why they did it. And that's exactly what has unfolded the past few years. I put all of the blame squarely at the feet of Hamas and its leaders, not at Israel for protecting and defending itself. That is a basic human right that every nation in the world has. And so that's a brief rundown. Some of it's my opinion, but I stand firmly on that.
Thank you. Definitely, if time would more allow, we could expand much more on this topic, both with your experience and knowledge. But as we are coming to wrap up this conversation, at least for this time, we could finish. With this question, what do you believe that God is calling each of us as those that are committed followers of Jesus or Yeshua? What's our calling or response to do in relation to Israel and the Jewish people today? What should be the response of us as Christians in the days we are right now?
So this is actually a very delicate and difficult question. I would say, first of all, as followers of Jesus, the first thing we're actually called to do is be good humans, which is to say we're called to be
Amen.
good neighbors. You think that would be a basic thing that everyone would understand, but we are called to be good neighbors. And right now, I live in a very Jewish neighborhood in the Midwest in the United States, and my neighbors are afraid right now. At the time of this recording, just 2 days ago, there was a mother and daughter in Vienna that disappeared. They were Israelis. They were tourists. They disappeared. There was a Jew in Australia that was attacked. Jews stabbed in the streets of New York City. Jews are routinely being attacked. Jews, Israelis, all over the world, simply because they are Israelis, not because they are right-wingers, not because they're religious fanatics, not because they're Zionists. People don't ask questions. You're a Jew. That's all they need to know. And they are being attacked. My neighbors are afraid. If my neighbors were Muslim and they were being attacked, I would be a good neighbor to my Muslim neighbors right now. But that's not happening. Rather, my Jewish neighbors are being attacked. So we have to start out by being good humans, by being, good neighbors and standing with the oppressed. This is one of the basic principles of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. He is always the God of the underdog, the oppressed, the downtrodden, the little ones, the forgotten ones, the hated, the marginalized, the rejected. And it's important to recognize that the Jewish people, as a minority people group, one of the smallest minority people groups in the history of the world are one of the most significant, or if not the most significantly persecuted, hated, hunted, murdered people group in the history of the world. And so again, they are people that, even if forget everything else that we've talked about, all of the controversy of Israel and the covenants, if just for that reason that they are the single most targeted minority people group in the world, we as Christians should be standing with them and supporting them, understanding how they feel. So I would start there. But beyond that, we are called, one of the things I try to do is, in an age of social media where everyone's getting all of their education from TikTok and YouTube, I'm trying to counter many of the lies, much of the propaganda, and much of it is just outright satanic lies from hell.
Hmm.
The type of lies that have been repeated about the Jewish people down through history. We're seeing some of the biggest podcasters and voices in the American media who are spewing rhetoric that's not much different than Adolf Hitler. So I try to counteract and correct a lot of these lies and propaganda. But there's also the issue of, and this is where it becomes very difficult when we form meaningful relationships with Jews, friendships, is that we are also called to bear witness concerning the truth of Yeshua and the gospel. And the difficulty with that is most Jews today, if they're familiar with their own history, they'll say, listen, if you support me, I'm happy to be a friend. But my boundaries are, I don't want you to preach to me about Jesus. And most Christians hear that. They say, well, unless I can preach Jesus to you, then I'm going to, burn that relationship. I'm only interested if I have the right to sort of lecture you. And I'm of the opinion that we as Christians should lay down that privilege. I believe that we should have friendships without any ulterior motives. Simply standing with someone who's oppressed and suffering and scared, that alone is enough. Now, if that individual says, I don't want to hear about Jesus, then I'm going to respect that person's boundaries. But if trust is gained and they say, I would be open to hearing and chatting about these things, then absolutely, I would love to talk to you about the gospel, about the scriptures, about the Bible, and these type of things. And so it's a very delicate thing. Interfaith relationships need to be very transparent.
Hmm.
There's no room for secret evangelism, stealth evangelism. These are the things that break trust. When others behave that way toward us, we call them wolves in sheep's clothing. And yet too many Christians try to behave that way. It's much better to come to a person and say, this is who I am. What are your boundaries? Here's mine. And then to honor one another's boundaries. But if trust is built and someone is open to hearing about Jesus, then yes, our job is to share the gospel with them. And of course, to share it in the public sphere. But I mean, one-on-one, we have to be respectful. In other words, when we build friendships, we should also abide by the normative, healthy adult rules of relationships. Simply because we're Christians, we shouldn't bypass normal social skills.
Yeah, these days that's not to be taken for granted, I suppose. So thank you for mentioning that. And yeah, I want to thank you, Joel, as a fellow American Latvian. Well, the Latvian part is fellow for us. Thank you for taking your time. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and grounded perspective. It's, as I said before, it's highly valued. And again, I will put the link to Joel's book that we kind of went through parts of it today. When a Jew Rules the World. I love the beautifully controversial title. I think it's great, Joe has many other books that is definitely recommended for reading. So with that being said, again, Joel, thank you for your time, and have a blessed continual journey of sharing your knowledge with many. So shalom to all, and see you soon. Bye bye.